Hi, I'm Scott Langdon, and this week on God and Autobiography, the podcast, Jerry welcomes back Matt Cardin for our latest Life Wisdom Project episode. In this episode, Matt and Jerry discuss several passages in the God book that offer God's insight into what's going on with God's dark side, and what God says about the ultimate order and structure of things in this world. Next week, join Jerry and me as we head to the email bag to find out what's on your mind. If you enjoy our work, please like it, subscribe to it, and share it with everyone. I hope you enjoy the episode. I'll see you next time.
Well, here we're trying to figure out, Matt, we're trying to figure out what takeaways there are for, just listeners who aren't studying history of religions or any of this stuff, and aren't even trying to, at this point, trying to do a theological job of, what's the nature of the ultimate reality or the divine, but how should one live? And I guess I was struck by a kind of bottom line. It comes toward the end, but it's almost summarizes a lot of what had gone before, that life is a battlefield, and an awful lot of religions are very placid, you might say, have a much more peaceful view of life, and you just let it be, you might say, and accept that. But that's not the view that Zoroaster brings to it. It's life is a battlefield, and we all have to just pick sides. In fact, that's almost a quote from Zoroaster's writing.
Yes, it is. Yes, I mean, and obviously, Zoroastrianism is one of the primary world religious traditions that we point to, right? When we look at that as the idea of life itself and the point of any religious consciousness, any spiritual consciousness being to recognize that battle. I mean, we use the term Manichaean, which actually,
Yes.
I hope you're not getting too much noise in the background here, which comes from the figure of Mani, who was somewhat significantly later, who lived and taught significantly later than Zoroaster, but he brought the Zoroastrian position and worldview forward several centuries, and we've associated his name with it when we talk about a Manichaean battle or a Manichaean scenario or a Manichaean dichotomy. We're talking about an absolute opposition of light to darkness and good to evil, and definitely that's been a
except here.
Except I know
twins. They're twins.
They're
The
twins.
good
That's
God and
the
the
thing.
evil side, and so that shows there are two aspects of the one divine reality,
of the one God, and that is the part that is fascinating to get into. I mean, it's like you move further. It's a triangulation, right? You have maybe you have the point at the top, and then you have the one angle going down to the right and the one angle going down to the left, to the twins, right? But they're united at the top. I think I just kind of did a Trinity thing. I didn't mean to do that by invoking a triangle.
All of my Christian friends, of whom almost all my colleagues have Christian roots in my work in religion, the American Academy of Religions, and everything comes in threes.
That makes sense. I can see that.
And there immediately it can be water, ice, and steam. And immediately parcel out to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost.
Absolutely.
So it's a deep template that actually works for an amazing number of things. It's perfectly apt, you might say.
It does. It does. And in this particular case, it certainly does when you have the really sensitive conversation between you and God in the book, as dramatized in the episode. And through that dialogue, God lays out, and Jerry in the episode, voiced by your partner, in this endeavor, sort of keeps asking and understanding and say, so Zoroaster, through his dedication to the truth, actually uncovered this, saw this, recognized this, Angra Mainyu and Ahura Mazda, And so God, these are actually both you. I mean, that's
Right,
I
right.
like the dialogue aspect. I really do, and I like the
Well,
fact
I'm a
in your
pedestrian philosopher, so I was,
sure,
what,
sure, sure.
what?
Dialogue. What are we talking about? Why would
Yeah,
you do it as a
yeah,
dialogue? Where'd that
yeah.
come from?
But
But you, it's a great. I know it's something that actually came out of your writing of the book and your interacting with God. And but I'm just so I don't want to. What's the word I'm looking for here? Cheapen it by saying cool or good job or nicely
right,
dramatized.
a
But
literary
it is
craft.
great.
Yeah. Well,
It
in
is
fact,
great.
the book is almost a transcript.
Yes. Yes.
First version was a transcript,
Yep.
and Abigail read it, the only person who read that version, and she said, "Hey, honey, the readers aren't hearing God. You need to put yourself in."
Yep.
And so I told how this happened and where it happened and so forth. And then there was another version, and then readers of that second version, so far from being published, said,
Yep.
"What did your wife think?" And so then I went back. She had not said much. So I went back and asked, "What were you thinking? And why didn't you say much?" And she said, "Well, I thought something important was happening here. And I didn't want to create, static on the line. And, well, that shows a very wise wife, for one thing.
Yes.
And one, these spiritual things are sensitive, and you have to respect that.
Absolutely, I agree. And by the way, that's a far better response than the possibly apocryphal story about Robert Louis Stevenson, who
Well,
was deeply moved to write what turned out to be the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, almost in this burst of not automatism, but this total eruption from the subconscious. And as the potentially apocryphal story goes, his wife was so horrified by it that she burned the manuscript and he had to rewrite it.
no,
So
well, Abigail did not burn the manuscript.
far
No,
better than that. Far
yeah,
better than the Stevenson story.
yeah, right.
Um,
Well, what do you think life is a battlefield, or maybe a different way to put it is not one doesn't have to take that as the whole story,
yes,
but what can one learn from that?
I feel like the motif of life as a battlefield certainly works on a level and is what some of us experience, some of us more than others. I mean, it's real it's in its own way. It is a real thing. And I hadn't, it's been a while since I read the God book in full, some parts of it longer than others. And I reread the portions that we're here talking about and was struck once again by the level of depth to which the conversation went to get to that point, to see, oh, so we're talking about life as a battlefield. The subtle characterizations of the fact that no, good is not just uh, an abstraction and evil is not just an abstraction. These are really in human experience. These are expressions of realities, of real realities in the divine reality. I thought that's real. And so I myself, for example, in my own experience, I know that I uh, I feel in my personal self sense, I feel uh, tasked with selecting between options externally and impulses within myself that do have a moral valence. They do have a moral, a good and evil reality attached to them. The thing is, what I always circle back around to, and what I appreciate about the particular framing of an understanding of Zoroaster and his insight in your book, is that even though that can play out on the human level, and even though I would say we are charged with living a life in which we make choices with that being the circumstance, that's the human circumstance, and we do live in an experience of duality where moral distinctions are not immaterial at all. Um, that higher unity is important to recognize. And if you don't, you're not recognizing something about reality. And you had asked me to look at some to look through the text and maybe identify some lines that I thought were worth
Yes,
drawing out. I can tell
yeah,
you that one of them is this is the line: most people, even spiritually attuned people, are not really seekers after the truth.
Oh, yes.
Even spiritually attuned people are not really seekers after the truth. And of course, in the book, that is in the context, it has a wider meaning, of course, but it's in the context also of saying Zoroaster was. And that's why he could go to this level of depth in his understanding of the good and the evil, those twins that arise from the one. I would agree, and that most people, even those who are spiritually inclined or attuned, are not exactly seekers after truth. And I don't remember the exact way in which the line develops further in the chapter that it's in the God book, but it says something along the lines of most people are more interested in a specific principle or idea or cause or something they can apply to life, to their life and their relationships and the practical reality of things, and employ that, and figure out, within the field of their life how to live, right? How and that's not immaterial, but the truth itself, if you're really spiritually attuned, just beyond, say, being interested, perhaps even mainly intellectually, in religious things, the truth itself is going to take you places that the pursuit of the truth itself is going to take you places that make you uncomfortable and that go beyond any pat notions of what good and evil actually are or appear like, and beyond pat notions of who and what you yourself are, and beyond the boundaries of whatever worldview you have been living in, with, and from, through a combination of, heredity and environment and what has been inculcated in you. Most people, even spiritually inclined people, not being really seekers after truth. Yeah, I think we all try to live within some kind of sheltered view. And reading that line, I think many of us who are interested in spiritual and religious matters would want to instantly assume, well, that doesn't describe me. I'm really after the truth.
Right.
But in my experience and that of many other people whom I know and trust, yourself included, because I know that your own experience with these matters has been ongoing and profound and transformative. Unless you've reached something where your interest takes you to a point that actually shakes the foundations of how you understand self, world, cosmos, reality, how you even understand the truth, I think you haven't reached the point where you have matured into a real seeker after truth. Now, that departs from the specific focus on Zoroaster that we're talking about here, but maybe not, because Zoroaster was someone it turns out that his actual clarity of seeking after the truth has us talking about him millennia after he was after he was there. So it does relate back to that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, my sense is that, and I think this is what God's gloss on most people are not seekers after the truth, is that they've found some truth. And mostly in life, you go along until you found enough truth to satisfy you, you might say,
Right.
and help you live your life, orient it, help you come up with some coherent sense of things, what reality is like and what's important and what's less important. And there the search doesn't go on. The Socratic model is wonderful because one of the crucial things about Plato is he never sums up a final answer, and you're always questioning. You're always questioning and finding a great deal of truth along the way of questioning. I just ran across, I'd forgotten the lines, but a quote, somebody was quoting toward the end of Plato's dialogue, Gorgias, I'm going to tell you, Socrates is saying to Gorgias is a hopeless case, but I'm going to tell you a story, and I'd like you to think of it as true. Well, that's a nice, soft, sense of, well, take it seriously. Take it seriously. And it's kind of the limitations of being a soul, a closed soul like Gorgias. But here, I guess I take it more seriously, but I know you're a non-dualist and have other visions. And there's always that thought you haven't gotten to the ultimate. I guess I'm not trying myself to get to the ultimate.
Yep.
In that sense, no, I've been given one job, and it's a big job. It's really, as a atheist friend of mine, one of the first long time friend of mine, academic, when I just told him the basic story, he said, it's a revelation about revelations.
Yes.
And this is the age for a revelation about revelations in a way that maybe, well, I don't know, certainly 50 years ago, it wouldn't have made much sense. There wouldn't have been an opportunity to think that way. Now there's ample opportunity to think, we need to take in that larger picture. And I always encourage people, they don't want to go this far, usually, my academic colleagues, take in your own personal experience. That seems to me an important part of the picture.
It has to be.
Yeah, that's where you sit and what you see, right?
I was going to, and then see, when you say take into account your own personal experience, I would focus on that and essentially not leave that. You and I have never known anything but our own personal experience. And yes, when we philosophize, and yes, when we theologize, right, we are trying to talk about, in some way, to talk about reality itself, which commonly the consensus view of things wants to think, even if not articulate, even if just as an assumption, is not to be found within that, or at least not wholly within that, not wholly within your subjective experience. But it's not a call to a destructive and unwarranted solipsism, to point out and then to pause, more than just pointing out, to dwell in and to really dig into, and to suddenly, sometimes with a hair-raising sense of, oh my God, feel a hair-raising sense of revelation and confirmation, and maybe one of those moments I said that rattles your cage.
Mm-hmm.
You realize that, for real, I have never known, I do not know, I will never know, I categorically cannot know, because knowing means knowing anything but my own experience. And that right there, immediately assumptions rush in, and one wants to say, if you're brought up, say, in the cultural context that I was, or with the background assumptions, of the worldview and the consensus reality, am I saying I'm trapped? Oh no, I can never know anything. The problem of knowledge. No, that in itself is just a series of thoughts arising in my present experience. You mentioned that I go for non-duality.
Yeah.
Seriously, that the fact of my present experience, seeing you here on this screen and hearing your voice as we talk, and seeing and experiencing this physical form that I, for lack of a better word, call me, sprouting out of the nothingness of the awareness from which I'm speaking right now, recognizing the thoughts forming and the emotions that both precede them and come after them as I'm interacting with you like this and speaking, all of that. This is taking place within the field of my experience. What else do I know? What have I ever known?
Well, you and I,
I knew all that. This is what was there, and then I was given seemingly external cues about how to divide it all up, and what to call it. When I read, to bring it back, I know we can go anywhere we want with the conversation, but to think back to the Zoroastrian thing, it's very interesting how that's a story about recognizing a splitting, an insight into the twins, the light and the dark twins from the one, because really that division is what begins to happen in every one of our personal experiences at birth, right? Where we're faced with this just field of whatever it is that's undifferentiated at first. And then the most basic distinction, this is I, this is not I. The rest of everything I'm seeing is somehow not I happens. And after that, the entire dictionary of categorizations we make of the different shapes that appear in experience. I find this to be endlessly fascinating. I think there's endless depth in it.
here, again, think of how we're to live our lives. What God says about his own experience is my parts are not always well integrated.
Right.
And when you think, according to this vision, we have multiple parts and they're not all good. He says,
Yes.
my own wisdom, he calls my calm center, assesses things, weighs them into balance, pacifies disturbances. And there is, of course, God says to Jerry, an analog for human beings. So the story is not just a metaphor. And it's really me struggling to supersede other aspects of myself and so on. So a lot of the story, in a practical way, is to not have your parts run amok. And I once heard somebody talk about cancer, a medical person on TV program. Oh, cancer cells are very healthy. They're just run amok. They're dysfunctional for the organism. Everything, has its purpose, its role, and you got to not let your separate parts, urges, run amok.
That's actually one of the three lines that I chose.
Oh, really?
From the chapter was the one where God says, "My aspects have to some extent a life of their own and go wayward." Tons of insight. Exactly what you're saying. Tons of insight packed into that. And again, I talked about this whole subjective experience of things. When we're talking about these things, I find it necessary to relate them back to my own experience, not in a way to reduce them, but more in a way to expand the significance of what I am experiencing. These things that we're talking about, we are not ontologically separate from. And again, and as you said, I don't think it's an idea. I think it's just a reality that that God is in this way like us, that we are in this way like God, that actually it amounts to the same thing. We're not completely integrated. We have these roiling, competing energies and so on and so forth. That is one of the primary insights to guide a life, not just for God. And if we recognize that in God, it helps when we recognize it in ourselves, and vice versa. Because if I'm not knowing, for example, in something as mundane as how am I going to get along with my wife when I get home tonight? How am I going to treat her? What am I going to how has her day been? How has my day been? What am I bringing with me that I may not recognize in the way of if anything went wrong in my work day or something like that, or what is she bringing with her? Good Lord, it certainly helps to realize that what's going on in the cosmos that we can see as this struggle between what appears to be a polarity in ethical and other ways of energies. It comes right down to the fact of me saying hello to my wife when I get home and finding out if there's something that's going to happen that I say, well, how did it go there? Well, that's what happens. My aspects to some extent have a life of their own and go wayward. I can say that about myself, just like God says it in the book.
But it does help if, as you're doing right now, if you think before you go home. I'm in a bad mood because we had a bad meeting and budget cuts, something bad.
Yeah.
And I can't. You can share that when you come home, but you can't bring the bad temper,
Right.
full-bodied home, or it's going to be itself living a lie, treating her as if she were part of this bad meeting, which she is not. She's doing something different. And anyway, you go through that period where you draw your parts together in a more functional integration.
Sure.
And, that battlefield sounds as if you're always fighting some horrible people. Well, the world has horrible people, but the most serious fights, good versus evil, is within oneself, God says. It starts with the internal conflicts, and the integration is a way of resolving those by having your different conflicting parts lined up well in terms of the whole.
Absolutely. I, one thing that kept coming to mind as I was reintroducing myself to these portions of the God
Yeah.
book was one of the passages from the book of Isaiah that struck me years ago. You know my background in horror writing, and you know that
Yes, yes. No, it's too scary. I've read some. It's very well, very good stuff, but I can only read the tepid, tepid stuff. I can tell it's well done. But
well, thank you, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for letting me know I must be doing it well because most of it is too horrible to read, right?
exactly.
And as you know that it's for me for whatever reason with the makeup of my psyche and my
Yes.
activity, it's been the bulk of my fiction writing has been, and even a bunch of my nonfiction writing, my essay writing has been pursuing ever more refined and clear expressions of the intersection or the nexus or the meeting point of religion with supernatural horror and ontological horror, metaphysical horror, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that was just, it really consumed me for years. And I knew that when I was younger, I think I've told you this, I was at
Had
first growing
horrible
up.
experiences.
Yeah, the sleep paralysis experiences with the hypnagogic experience of the demonic figures. Yes, that was
Yes.
transformative to me. And that was coming after a childhood when at first my religion that I was growing up in, evangelical Christianity, was just rote. But then at some point I really woke up to it in my teens and I took it seriously. It was a possession of mine. I read my Bible and prayed and have done so off and on for years. But then I was equally with helpless fascination drawn to supernatural horror. Those kind of came together in a way in my writing as driven by these unplannable for experiences of seeming metaphysical assault over a span of years in my 20s. And I was mining uh, non-Christian, world religious traditions and drawing great fascination and solace from reading about Zen and Advaita Vedanta and that kind of thing. But I kept reading my Bible and so on. And when I came across a passage in Isaiah that I seemed never to have read before, this just became like I don't know, a magnetic center for me for a while, trying to understand what's going on. It's Isaiah 45, verses 6 and 7, and it has Yahweh speaking, and he says, "There is none beside me." You probably know the verse. "I am the Lord, and there is none else. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things." And maybe I had heard it in a sermon or read it myself earlier in life. I don't know. But when it seemed that I discovered that for the first time in my 20s, maybe I did, at a time when my life was upended in various ways. That just drew a whole lot of things together. I was also learning more about the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures than I had before. Felt like I was reaching a more realistic and sophisticated understanding than I had from my tradition. And to see there that stated in that passage, a long pre-Christian passage, that there is no other power. There is just the Lord. There is just Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
And he says in this canonical scripture, no, I'm alone. Light, darkness, both from me. Peace, or sometimes it's translated as blessing or weal, and then calamity or war or chaos or woe, that kind of thing. Those are from me. I do all those things. It riveted me. It sat me up in my seat. And it was coming to mind, as I said, as I was rereading the passages on the Zoroaster conversation from the God book, because, I know the coming after the end of the episode of the podcast that deals with those chapters, right? It may be the very next chapter of the book that is titled something like "The Old Testament is an Answer to Zoroaster."
Yes, yes.
And so I thought I must have been remembering that or something when I was rereading and listening to these things and knowing that's where it was going, because this old verse for me was coming back. At the time, I took it as sort of fuel for further exploring what came to be in some of my stories that I wrote, an interrogation into the potentially monstrous aspects of God,
Yeah.
in my stories. oddly, all this time later, when you and I were talking before we really started having our conversation for the episode here about my current creative hibernation, where I have announced to my online readers that I'm taking an indefinite break. I'm detached from all social media and not publishing and not doing anything. I find these same verses from Isaiah to be greatly comforting with the insight that they express.
Okay.
We were talking about the idea of God's aspects having a life of their own and going wayward, and that being the part of the Zoroastrian insight. The monotheistic Hebrew religious insight, the Jewish religious insight, is you see disaster happening, you see chaos, you see what seems to be darkness and evil, you feel like, oh no, you almost start singing a Longfellow poem or something. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, and how wrong is going to win. There is no solace. There is no peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Wait a minute. This is all from God. God is holy. Holy does not necessarily, especially in Isaiah, mean conventionally moral and ethical. It means categorically other, the one that is unlike any other, and therefore is of this essence that it is our place and fearsome duty to, fearful duty to somehow learn to accord with reality. God is the font of reality, and so light, dark, good, evil. There's something about that doesn't make God seem that doesn't incline me anymore to try and seek out the monstrous in God's nature and write fictionalizations of that in some kind of supernatural horror framework. Although that's legit, that's valid. I mean, it's not like the viewpoint itself is outlawed or invalidated. Maybe it's just a different point in my life. I go, certainly as an individual, me as Matt, my job is to do like God is talking about in the book, find a way to integrate these things, and find a way to choose and develop and maximize the good and the right. The other stuff is not some absolutely alien enemy from outside anything that could possibly be considered something I have an affinity with. It is of God. Those things in me are of me. That's actually part of the integration process right there.
What other passages had you picked out from things God said, God quotes? Were there others, or if we kind of happened to have touched on them?
Just one.
Just one.
There's a first and a second part, and the first part is the one I wanted to focus on. It's the same sentence, but the part that says it's a sentence from God again, not from Jerry in the book, not from you.
Right.
To look evil in the face is a spiritual act.
Oh, yes.
To look evil in the face is a spiritual act. Now, I like that excerpted by itself because it's punchy and it could serve as a focus of fruitful meditation. The end of the sentence says that doing that, looking evil in the face, being a spiritual act, says it requires being in touch with me, says God, and looking, as it were, through my eyes, which may draw right back to exactly what I was just
the Isaiah insight.
It's potent stuff. It's the kind of thing that if one is drawn to words, some people of a spiritual and religious persuasion are not. There are other things for them. Great. Good. But for those who are drawn to verbal expressions of things and find in them a way inward, for spiritual depth and contemplation, dwell on that one for a while. To look evil in the face is a spiritual act. And then add, it requires being in touch with God and looking, as it were, through God's eyes to be able to look evil in the face. Everything is suddenly drawn together, both metaphysically and morally in our lives as beings who are called upon to try and find the way to make a moral pathway through a sometimes confusing life.
Yeah. I mean, it's striking because you got to recognize it as evil. And that's what somehow it goes on to saying, I think God continuing. Otherwise, you see it all bad childhood, or, you explain it away.
Yeah.
Some way. But no, meanwhile, whatever the genesis of it, it's evil. It's evil. And you got to see it as evil And that's, as it were, through your divine eyes, you see, yikes. I was always disturbed by this theme that you warmed to, or at least at this point in life, warmed to, Matt. And at one point, I often quote this for some reason, so it obviously sticks in my mind. I was saying to some of this kind of talk, it sounds as if you're saying Lady Macbeth is just fine. God was saying the universe has to have characters like Lady Macbeth. And I say, it sounds as if you're saying she's just fine, that she's okay. And God replies, it's yeah, I said, it's as if you're saying it's okay. He said, no, it's as if you're not listening to me. No, it is evil. It's wrong. It's bad. But in a world with organic creatures, with intelligence, desires, purposes, free will, these kind of complexities, these beings, this kind of being is going to be capable of murder. And that doesn't mean murder is fine, but the universe somehow, I'm told at some point, friction is essential to reality. We always imagine if you could have the plane that had no bumps in it, everything would just zoom. They first imagined with airplanes, if you get rid of friction, they later learned they couldn't fly at all without friction. But that this is part of this complex reality that we and God live through. And then the challenge is to be truthful, to recognize that reality, to recognize our own participation in it, even maybe the way Jung likes to talk about, to accept one's shadow self, the kind of aspects of oneself you don't prefer.
Absolutely.
But rather than making them into Jekyll and Hyde, speaking of Jekyll and Hyde, and trying to parcel them out, you accept. Which doesn't mean you don't try to say, oh, I've got to try to change this bad habit, let's call it. But you take it in that this is all this unseemly aspect of yourself. Instead of just averting your own eyes from yourself, you take it in and try to. In fact, there's a wonderful prayer in the Jewish tradition. Lord, they've got the concept of the evil impulse. Please if I do evil, please let me serve higher purposes, be turned to divine purposes. And so, okay, you can, even there are things you can never change about yourself, perhaps, but you can kind of hope that they work out in some positive way, the way, maybe horror writing is a positive thing, even though there's a lot of parts one would want to avert one's eyes from there.
Ramsey Campbell is one of the great living horror writers. He's a British author, has won the Bram Stoker Award, World Fantasy Award, total genius. And he is among those who have spoken pretty potently about horror being the genre that is devoted to not looking away. And there's a spirituality to that. That's kind of like Scott Derrickson. He's a Hollywood director. He's probably most famous now for having directed a couple of the Doctor Strange movies, a couple of the Marvel Comics movies. He began by directing horror, including The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which is a very fine religious horror movie. He himself is a Christian, prominently so, and has spoken specifically about Christianity very famously back in the aughts. He talked about how he thought horror was actually the ideal genre for talking about religious and spiritual matters, kind of like in the same way that Ramsey Campbell talked about it being the type of storytelling about not looking away. It actually goes for right and wrong and good and evil and interrogation of what the nature of reality is, And I don't mean to make this into a side dissertation on a field that I've worked in for a long time. You were reminding me of that, though, and when you talked about Jung and the idea of the shadow, we're in sync because at the same time I was thinking of Freud and the desire, the very astute, insightful principle that he articulated, although of course it had been around in other forms for essentially forever. The return of the repressed, that which we repress, which we eject and refuse to acknowledge, is precisely that which is going to come back, in some sort of nemesis-like form. I mentioned Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde earlier just because of that story about Stevenson's wife burning his manuscript. I wasn't really thinking about the fact of its division of the human self into the light self and the dark self applying here. Didn't come in meaning to talk about that, but you brought it up again, and it does. And really, what happens in that story is that Dr. Jekyll, kind-hearted, brilliant, basically saintly, the best guy you could ever want, best guy you could want to know or be, because of that quality of himself, had wanted to find a way to develop a drug or some technique that could purge humans of the evil side of themselves. And what it ended up doing was creating this dichotomy between them where, if you want to look at it this way, the whole story is a pre-Freud story of a return of the repressed, kind of, or a letting loose, a liberation, an unbinding of this dark side. And so his attempt to eradicate it and just write it out of his map of reality of himself and the world.
He can be
Goes
pure,
haywire.
but he's created pure evil in the process.
All he's done by unbinding it from himself is to give it this autonomous existence, like we keep talking about God's own parts going wayward. It really is an astute story, both psychologically and, I would say, spiritually.
Yeah.
And it's something that we're talking about right here, and it does go into the Zoroastrian model of things, where both twins have their legitimate reality, but there's also the legitimate question and answer of how to put it, which one we are to back.
Well, yes.
You just accepting the reality of the evil does not mean accepting that the evil is fine. Like you said about Lady Macbeth, it's not saying, and it's great, go ahead and do that. It's great, somebody, go ahead and be a mass murderer, because, that's real, and it would be foolish to deny it. On one level, yes, foolish to deny it. On another level, monstrous in its own right to champion that, or at least to not recognize the call to greet that in the right way and try to develop beyond that, which is exactly what, in different language, God is revealing to you in that conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Matt. I will let you get on with your day. This has been a wonderful discussion, as it always is with you. You're a deep thinker who's read everything, as far as I can tell, and that makes it a pleasure. And you're a very good friend at long distance. We've never met in person.
I know. I appreciate. I have cherished your friendship for years as well, Jerry. It's just strange, and in its own way, charming that it has developed through nothing but these long distance conversations for a long span of time.
That's the way of the world, maybe now. I just had two encounters, both Zooms, people I've never met that had a profound impact on me. And I may never meet these two people, but anyway, the impact, we may become friends the way you and I have become long distance intermittent friends.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com and always at godandautobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@godandautobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective. as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.